Today I'm going to continue talking about, the rise of the British Empire. I'm primarily going to talk about the Stewart period, which I'll kind of talk about this a little bit today and probably into part three, which will take a little while into next week. But I'll kind of talk about how under Britain at the time, especially in England, they of course experienced the English Civil War, which totally kind of changed the country afterwards. Of course, we'll get also to the Commonwealth period, of course, as they call it, or the interregnum, where Oliver Cromwell kind of takes over the country. And actually, Britain goes through a period where they experience kind of a republic, I think it's the only major period where they actually kind of a republic. Well, the United States is a republic, but they've never really been much of a republic at all. So from last lecture, I had been talking about, of course, we got into the rise of the British Empire, kind of talking about Tudor England, kind of talking about Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth. We have the so-called English Reformation with the rise of the Anglican Church and all that. We had talked about how Elizabeth had died. She was 69 years old when she died in 1603 after reigning close to around 45 years. And I think we talked about how King James came in and, of course, took over as the next, ruler. And so you have the Stewart Dynasty that rise to power, that takes over the country at this point right here. You can see there's about 7 rulers of the Stewart Dynasty that reigned from 1603 to 1714. Of course, King James we'll talk about first. We'll talk about some of the other. I'll talk about, of course, Charles I, who helps pretty much cause the English Civil War to break out. King James, kind of a little bit about him. He had been already on the throne of Scotland for many years. There, of course, a picture of him right there. James, of course, was the king of Scotland actually for 57 years. I think going back to 1567, he had already been king there. One of the longest reigning kings in Scottish history, 1567 to 1625, you can see. And then, of course, he became also the king of England and Ireland, 1603. And so one of the things that happened, of course, with King James is that he became one of the first rulers of what we call Great Britain. Of course, they start using that term afterwards, which I think he kind of used the term. And so he's this first ruler that kind of unites a lot of these kingdoms together, especially England and Scotland. They're kind of merged together at that point. Not really officially at this point, but it will, of course, later. Here's a you can see kind of a family tree, of course, of the Stuart family, which is here. So you got James at the top. Then you got Charles I, followed by Charles II, then James II. Then you got William and Mary, and then you got Queen Anne. So you can see a total of 7 rulers that were part of the Stewart Dynasty that reigns over, I guess we call it Great Britain later. The Stuarts, though, go back a long way. You can see they go back to the 14th century, ruling over Scotland a long time ago. But James, like I said, James I, as he calls it in England, is considered the first king of Great Britain that you have overall. There is that interregnum period we'll get to later, of course, where Oliver Cromwell kind of reigns for a short period where they're not ruling, but I think they don't really count that, the Stuarts. But we'll get later into like a lot of the problems with the Stuarts later, because there's this deal where some of them are Catholic, and that's kind of an issue that they have over time. Now, back to King James. James, of course, his main wife was Anne of Denmark, and they had 2 children together. Of course, Charles I, who was later king after James died. And, of course, he also had a daughter who was named Elizabeth. That was important. She was later the so-called Queen of Bohemia. And that was his children. And I think there's a story where James and his wife, Queen Anne, didn't exactly get along, supposedly. But the big thing that was a problem, I know, when King James came in was that James was kind of like a lot of the Stuarts. They believed in a lot of divine right theory, and so there was a lot of conflict between him and Parliament and all that, especially about a lot of his expenditures. I think was a major problem that he had early on because he kind of overspent a lot as part of his annual budget. But we'll talk about, of course, the things that are, of course, more famous. Of course, James, we already know, was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, that we've talked about before. Now, there were some incidents under him I did want to talk about that were famous, of course, under King James. They did have this incident right when he came in 1605 that was known as the Gunpowder Plot. Gunpowder Plot was this Catholic conspiracy to assassinate King James, like remove him from the throne. And they believed they were going to try to replace him with his daughter, Elizabeth, who they thought might be more sympathetic towards Catholics in the country, or might even be maybe converted to Catholicism or something like that. And the actual conspiracy involved several men that were Catholics. I think there were even some Jesuits involved in it as well. That picture on the bottom right, that's Elizabeth you're seeing right there in this picture. They're hoping to put her on the throne. And there's several men involved. There's like two main men involved that were most important, which was Robert Catesby. He was actually the leader of the Catholic conspirators. And they had another man who was very, very famous, of course, with the Gunpowder Plot, Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was a soldier that was the one that was actually in charge of the gunpowder barrels, and they were going to bring gunpowder barrels into the House of Lords. And when the king came to make a speech, the King James, I guess when they opened Parliament, they were going to blow him up, basically. But Robert Cecil, who like big spy master and chief advisor under King James at the time, uncovered the plot. And they actually arrested, I think the plot was supposed to happen on November 5th, but I know Fawkes was caught with the gunpowder barrels the day before, basically. So they saved the king and all that. The king wasn't killed. And so now in modern times, as you know, in Britain, they have, of course, this big celebration every November 5th. It's often called different names, Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Night. And they light bonfires at night, set off fireworks, and burn effigies of Guy Fawkes and things like that. So it's kind of a celebration that they do. I think they still pretty much do it in Britain, England, especially, of course, today. Looks like Carmen's also joining us this morning. So I hope you're having a great morning overall. So yeah, the Gunpowder Plot, of course, failed, of course, with James. Now let me talk about, of course, a few other things, of course, about James that's well known, that he's, of course, famous for overall. Now, James, they think, James was the one that helped to try and colonize throughout the world for what would be later the British Empire. Elizabeth had tried to colonize part of America. You may have heard of the Roanoke Island thing in, I think, off the coast of the Carolinas, where they tried to colonize there. And I think Newfoundland there was an attempt by the British to colonize there, but pretty much failed overall. But the big thing they, of course, did was you see here, they basically would colonize. One of the first areas they colonized was Virginia, where I think going back to Sir Walter Raleigh, they had started exploring the East Coast, and they had named it Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen. And I think Raleigh was the one that was behind trying to set up that Roanoke colony that failed. Sometimes called the Lost Colony. They call it now, I think, in American history. And these are the areas that he would colonize. Not just there, but he would colonize Jamestown, 1607, Northern Ireland. I'll talk a little bit about that. They would colonize that as well under him. Then Bermuda was another area in the northern Atlantic. They would also colonize there. They do think that part of why Jamestown developed was because of the Spanish. The Spanish were developing their colonies throughout North America and, of course, the New World. And so the British were hoping to, kind of counter them and create kind of rival colonies in like North America, especially the East Coast. And so the Virginia Company of London, which was a joint stock company eventually is the one that created the Jamestown Colony in 1607, named after King James. You remember the story of John Smith and Pocahontas, which is kind of associated with this period. And part of why they created it was to basically mine for gold. But when they got there, they didn't find any gold, which was kind of a problem. And so the colony actually struggled for a long time. But of course, did you know that, what eventually led to its success was actually the discovery of tobacco, which they started growing that as a cash crop, as you know. Of course, the negative side of that is they later brought in African slaves. And so slavery was also started in American history as well, or early American history at that time. They had the plantation of Ulster they had where they colonized Northern Ireland. That was something that he did as well. They got a lot of these people from southern Scotland and northern England to come in. The ones from Scotland were later called Scotch-Irish, if you know about that. And so the only thing about that was it was controversial later, even up to modern times with the English doing this, because they attempted to try and convert all the Irish there to the Protestant faith. They tried to force them to use the English language instead of Irish, and so create a lot of animosity. If you know about Ireland, and especially Northern Ireland, there's been a lot of sectarian violence that came out of that. Not really because of religion, but some people think Catholic versus Protestant, which is a problem. It was more of like more of a national political identity, them wanting to be Irish instead of being, say, pro-English or UK. And so you even have time up to the so-called the Troubles, if you know about that, they have in Northern Ireland, where you got the Irish Republican Army fighting the British and all that. And so it's a problem that they have a lot, throughout that period. It goes back to that time period. So anyways, kind of talking about some of the things that, King James is known for. Oh, and don't forget, there's one more thing that James was very famous for. Of course, the King James Bible, he established in 1611, which is, of course, like a kind of a third attempt at an English Bible, of course. This one became one of the most famous ever produced, which was developed from predominantly Greek, mostly from Greek texts of the Old and New Testaments. And the King James Version was pretty much developed by the Anglican Church, a lot of its scholars and ministers that were associated with it. And it was eventually completed in 1611, over several years. Of course, it is known for its Old English, use of thee, thy, and thou. Of course, if you ever read the King James Version, which is considered one of the most famous English Bibles, I think, ever produced in the world. So it's something that he kind of developed, more or less, King James. Now, the later part of his reign, if you know about King James, he became ill, like the last few years of his reign. And they had this man named George Villiers, who's known as the Duke of Buckingham, actually ran his court and also was the regent for his son, King Charles I, who would come in after James would die in 1625. There's been kind of rumors that Charles and the Duke of Buckingham were actually lovers, because there's this theory that James was bisexual, about that. There was an old saying about King James that when James was king, he was really a queen, was the saying on the streets, because I think people kind of knew about this, sort of. But back then, if they found out you were, gay or whatever, they'd probably put you to death, that kind of deal. So that's the next thing, of course, that happened, is that, his son came in and, of course, ruled next, which, of course, is King Charles I, who you see, of course, in this picture right here. Charles, of course, would reign from 1625 to 1649. The one, of course, most famous things that, Charles ends up doing is that he causes the English Civil War to break out. He's also one of the first major kings that they have, especially in modern Europe, that gets his head cut off. He gets executed, to something he's kind of famous for overall. But the English Civil War is something that that happens during this time period, which is a major event that happens in British history in the 17th century. And it's something we're going to, of course, talk about a lot, of course, today. Now, a little bit about the English Civil War. If you look at that, of course, slide there on the right, it wasn't really about the ruler himself that was in power. It was really more about the differences between how he was supposed to rule as a monarch. Was it supposed to be, like the French were doing, like with France, Louis XIV, where more like divine right, where the king's got all this power that he has? Or should it be like a limited monarchy is the other thing, of course, favored, which Parliament wanted. They wanted a limited monarchy where Parliament has a lot of power, to pass laws and raise taxes or whatever. And so that became kind of a major issue that helped to kind of cause the Civil War later, which would break out in 1642. There was another issue, too, that was very controversial about King Charles that I did want to talk about, which is famous. He was his marriage. He married Henrietta Maria, who was Catholic, Catholic daughter of King Henry IV, who, of course, he was a Huguenot that had converted to Catholicism, but basically she was the sister of Louis XIII. She's also the aunt, if you want, of Louis XIV, give you an idea how they're related. So that's kind of controversial. And of course, a lot of his children later, like, you have basically Charles II, James II, are basically cousins of Louis XIV that you have. So that was controversial about that, him basically marrying Henrietta Maria. And I think that a lot of these kings, like later, I think they seem to think some of the Stuarts were kind of sympathetic towards like the Catholics in general. So, but we'll talk about his sons later. Of course, the future kings, Charles II and James II. Now, of course, the big thing that caused a lot of problems is the fact that Charles believed in divine right. He thought that that Parliament or no one or no court could really tell a king, what to do. It's one of the things that helps get him executed, of course, later. And there was a big issue that they think helped to start really the English Civil War later, was this parliamentarian act that was passed called the Petition of Right that was occurred. And it was this constitutional type, act that basically was created to try and limit his powers. They thought that Charles was trying to do too much, even raise his own taxes in the country. And it did a lot of things. You can see there in that list right there, basically it said no tax without consent of Parliament, no imprisonment without trial, no quartering soldiers, especially in time of war, especially actually peacetime, not war. No martial law in time of peace, of course, was another thing as well. And so he was trying to behave more like an absolute monarch in general. And so eventually he decided that he'd had enough of what Parliament was trying to do. And so he dismissed Parliament. He basically dissolved it, is what he did. And so that leads into a period afterwards for about around 11 years where it becomes more of an absolute type monarchy. In fact, the closest the British maybe got at that point to that was when he was in power. That became known as, in England, they called it 11 years tyranny. I think was one name they called it. Or also they called it the personal rule. Personal rule of Charles I was the other name that he was called. And he even tried to, during that time, tried to raise his own taxes and things like that. There was one where he tried to tax all the cities. It was called ship money, I think it was. It didn't matter if it was on the coast or not, that kind of deal. Now, that went on for like 11 years. But what happened was in 1640, Charles had to recall Parliament because war broke out with Scotland. Scotland did not like what the English were trying to do, which was to push Anglicanism on Presbyterian Scotland. And the Anglican Church had episcopacy, which bishops and clergy and all that. They didn't want that. They wanted presbyters, these church elders that ran what they called the Church of Scotland, which was called the Kirk, is what they called it. The word Kirk meant basically church in Scottish. So they call it the so-called Bishops' War because they don't want bishops in Scotland, which I think the actually Scots were kind of successful with it in the war. But eventually he was forced to call Parliament because he needed, revenue to fight in wars. And so it led to these two parliaments that were founded. They had one called the Short Parliament, which was founded in May of 1640, but it didn't last but only 3 weeks. Well, they didn't want to do what he wanted, and so he dissolved them again at that point. And then right after that, he called a second parliament, which was called the Long Parliament. Now it's called that because it was in power for like 20 years, basically up to the time of right after Cromwell, of course, died. So that's where all the problems really start. Looks like Carlette is also joining us this morning as well. But they think that's when all the problems really started with the whole English Civil War. That's something I did want to talk about. That is famous. He struggles, with Parliament at this point. And there was a group of people in Parliament that were, of course, giving him fits. And if you know much about Parliament at that time, most of the members of Parliament that were in it were Puritans. None of you know much about Puritans and who they were in Britain at the time. The Puritans were English Protestants that wanted to purify the Anglican Church of England, of Catholicism. They thought it wasn't Protestant enough. And so they thought it needed reforming even more. And so a majority of the members of Parliament, like the MPs, were basically Puritans. And so that basically, caused a lot of problems with him. And it got to the point where King Charles I even tried to arrest members of Parliament. He sent troops into it. I think that was the thing where it kind of went to loggerheads. He sent forces actually into Parliament, like troops. When that happened, that's when all things blew up, of course, in his face. So see here is in January, they think, is when they think the Civil War really breaks out, when he sends about 400 soldiers into Parliament to arrest some people, like mostly the Puritan members that were there. And so basically the Civil War starts there. Mob violence actually does break out in London. Of course, fearing for his life, his family, and all that. Charles fled into northern England. He starts trying to rally up troops to fight against the Parliamentarian side. And the Parliamentarian side, they start, forming a force too to basically fight him as well. And so this leads into, of course, what will be the so-called English Civil War. But it wasn't really one war. That's one thing you have to know about the English Civil War. It was actually 3 civil wars. First one, second one, and third English Civil War, which happened over a period of almost a decade. But it's not just fought in England. They fight in England, they fight in Scotland, also in pretty much in Ireland as well. They do call it sometimes the British Civil Wars or English Civil Wars. But I have another name too. They call it a lot too for a long time, the War of the Three Kingdoms, because of those 3 kingdoms, of course, that were involved in the war. Now, they had different sides that were involved in the war that I did want to talk about, which of course were famous. And of course, these are the so-called opposing sides that were in the war. On one side, you had the Cavaliers that were fighting, and then the other side, you had the Roundheads. Those are some nicknames for the 2 different sides that fought in the war. The Cavaliers, what you see on the left there, were those that were the royalist side. They were the ones that backed King Charles and his armies. Most of them were like from the nobility. You can see wealthy landowners. Some were in the Anglican Church, and some were even Catholics that supported him. There were some Scottish people, of course, that also supported him as well during the war. On the other side, you had the Roundheads. That was the so-called Parliamentarian Forces, Parliamentarian armies. They were supported by Parliament, of course. There's a kind of a debate about why they're called Roundheads, but it had to do with their shape of their helmets. Supposedly, lobster pot helmets, maybe. I think another theory is that it had to do with their haircuts. They had that roundhead haircut, kind of like the Beatles or whatever. But they had a lot of people that were like mostly small landowners. You can see people that were manufacturers, but a lot of Puritan people. And that's one of the things that's probably most famous about it, was that a lot of the main officers that were in the Roundheads parliamentarian armies were Puritan. A lot of the officers were called grandees. And we'll get to it later, but they had generals like Oliver Cromwell, who was probably the greatest general on the parliamentarian side in the war. But they also had this other man named Sir Thomas Fairfax. He was actually the captain general, the top general, really, on the parliamentarian side, who was called Black Tom. I think I've got images showing both these men who were involved right here. Of course, Cromwell would become really famous in the war and after. Cromwell was originally a member of Parliament, and he, during the war, became a great cavalry general. Like, he was kind of seen as this military genius, and Cromwell had all kinds of nicknames. I think some people called him the Puritan Moses, but oftentimes he was called Old Ironsides because he led the main cavalry under Sir Thomas Fairfax, which was called the Ironsides. And I guess because he was so old, they gave him that nickname. And he was very religious. In fact, he thought that men that were very religious would fight better as soldiers. He had a famous quote that he once said, where he said, "I think that he that prays best will fight best." And I think Black Tom, as they call him, Sir Thomas Fairfax, was called that because he had kind of a tan complexion. And he wore these blackish uniforms, hence the name. But they say Cromwell was actually more famous than he was. Looks like Jasmine is also joining us this morning. So I hope you're having a great morning out there right now. Now, I did want to talk about, of course, one thing that was different, about the war in general. You got those two men that are right there. But during the war, one of the things that would happen, of course, that's real famous about the English Civil War was that the parliamentarian side developed their own army, which later was called the New Model Army. They nicknamed it. Developed in 1645, and it was considered one of the first major professional armies that the English fielded in wars. Pretty much the main army of the parliamentarian side from 1645 up. After that, I think before that they were just kind of organizing, and I think the first few years of the war were kind of not that great for either side in the beginning of it. But it's famous for fighting all over, like the different kingdoms. It fought mostly in England. They took their force into Scotland. They even invaded Ireland at one point as well. And they fought primarily using a combination of cavalry, which the cavalry was called the Ironsides, which was led by Oliver Cromwell during the war. The infantry used a lot of muskets, which were a combination of either matchlock or wheellock, which the wheellock was sometimes called the doglock as well. And then also infantry used pikes as well, which are long spears in the war. And you kind of see these right here, the kind of pikes that they use, which I think most pikes could be on average up to like maybe 18 feet or so long. A lot of those were sometimes deployed against, especially cavalry, that would try to attack infantry formations. But there's one thing I did want to show today, which is very interesting, kind of a little video clip for a few minutes, kind of showing you the different types of muskets that were used in the English Civil War. So let me go ahead and show you this video, of course, real quick.
Calibers or sizes. There was no real proofing guns that used to blow up because they hadn't been proofed or made properly.
Right.
So it was the early days and things were really quite unreliable.
In its use, as it were, on the battlefield, not very effective.
Very ineffective.
Yeah.
The early firearms like this were shorter range than the early stuff. Longbows and crossbows had longer range than the earlier muskets. 50 yards, you'd be struggling to hit somebody, whereas with a crossbow, you could probably put somebody down at 100 yards.
So, what scenario would they use this in? When would they fire it?
They were used.
All of these coming at you would just cause utter carnage.
Yeah, if they were firing volley fire into massed infantry, it would do a lot of damage rather than picking off individual shots. Volley fire was the answer against troops.
Well, of course, video there, of course, showing the different types of muskets used, of course, in the English Civil War. So anyway, of course, we'll talk more about the English Civil War. I did want to discuss some of the major battles, of course, that were famous in the English Civil War overall. There were a bunch of, besides Battle of Nasby, which we'll talk about the most today, there were at least 3 major battles that were very important in the English Civil War. They had Edge Hill. Edge Hill was considered one of the first major battles that was fought between the parliamentarian side and the royalist side, but it was inconclusive. Neither side really won that battle. They do think by the Battle of Marston Moor, which was in 1644, that's when really the war started to change more in towards the parliamentarian side. Marston Moor, which took place in York County in England, was considered the largest battle that was fought in the war. I think 40-something thousand troops, I think, combined on both sides was involved in that battle, which was considered at that time not that large really now compared to later times. But they did have one battle that was really important, which of course was the Battle of Nasby, which happened in June of 1645. Here's kind of an image showing you this battle here, but it was considered the most strategic battle of the war. That's the actual battle site, of course, where they fought this particular battle. And it pitted 2 different sides that were there. Of course, as you know, I told you Sir Thomas Fairfax was the one that was leading the new model army. And then commanding his cavalry, which I think was on his right flank, was Oliver Cromwell. I told you, Old Ironsides, as they dubbed him. Then on the royalist side, they had King Charles I, of course, but he had this nephew that he had, you see on the right, named Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who probably was one of the best generals on the royalist side in the war. He was actually a cavalry general that was from Europe, more German, but he basically was a nephew of Charles that fought in the war. He was mostly a cavalry commander. But the problem what happened in a lot of these battles later, but especially by the time of Nasby, was the fact that they were heavily outnumbered in the battle. If you go to this map here showing the battlefield, of course, of Nasby. Nasby, by the way, took place June 14th, 1645. It took place in Northamptonshire County, which is kind of due north of London, is where it is. But the new model army had a larger force. They had about 13,000 troops, which was a combination of infantry, of course, and cavalry. You can see there. And then the royalist side, they only had a force of about 7,500. You can see Rupert's on the right flank right there. Cromwell, of course, on his right flank on their side there. And I think Rupert made a charge on their right with the cavalry, but Cromwell was able to attack eventually into the center and left flank of Charles's royalist army. And what happened was the army of Charles was effectively destroyed in the battle. About 3/4 of their forces was actually either killed, wounded in the battle, and a lot of the force was actually captured, like about 4,000 or 5,000 troops. They were later paraded through London afterwards because of the decisive victory by the parliamentarian side. And so with that, the royalist side never recovered from that in the war. In fact, Charles was eventually captured in 1647, and he was eventually imprisoned on the Isle of Wight, which is off the coast of England, southern coast of England today. And so that's basically what happened with Charles. So he gets captured pretty much after that. But the only thing about that, which is true about the war would actually drag on. There's, of course, I'll get into talk about some few other things that happened in the English Civil War. But believe it or not, Charles escaped. He actually escaped from prison, and he fled to Scotland. And when he met with the Scots, some of the Presbyterians that were in favor of keeping him like on the throne, they were called Covenanters, or also called, I think they're called the other name. They're called the Engagers because they met or engaged with Charles I, and they made a deal with Charles and said, "We'd back you if you would allow basically our Church of Scotland to be pretty much controlled by presbyters instead of bishops or clergy." And so he agreed to it with that. And so that would actually cause another civil war, which was called the so-called Second English Civil War, would follow that, which I think starts around 1647-48. And so Cromwell again takes his forces up into Scotland at that point. And against the Scots, he eventually defeats them at the Battle of Preston, which happened in August of 1648 in northern England. And so after they're defeated again at that point, that's when Charles is basically captured a second time. So he's actually captured twice in the war. And one of the things that happens next at this point is Charles is eventually going to be put on trial. That's one thing that's very, very famous, of course, about him. And one of the first things that happened right afterwards, there was this man named Colonel Thomas Pride. He was under Cromwell's forces in the New Model Army. He did this purge where, I think in December of 1648, it's called Pride's Purge. And what he did was he purged all the members of Parliament that were basically, anti-New Model Army. He basically prevented anybody from taking their seats that were either pro-royalist or even pro-Presbyterian, like in Scotland, basically. And so at that, they were able to eventually, get enough members of Parliament to eventually create a high court of justice to basically try Charles. And the members that were left over from the Long Parliament, that had been not purged, were called later the Rump Parliament, is what they kind of nicknamed it. And so the High Court of Justice met after that. And one of the problems they had, though, with his, court and trial of Charles was that Charles, about it, refused to make a plea, like guilty or not guilty, because they have trial by jury, the English. And so he said that I have divine right. I'm a divine right, absolute monarch. Only God can, tell me what to do. He said that no court or no parliament can, make him do anything. And eventually they said that he was guilty anyway. And so what ended up happening, of course, with Charles was that he was eventually executed on January 30th, 1649. Of course, considered one of the first major modern kings to be executed, like in Europe. They think that's where the whole Humpty Dumpty story came from, but they couldn't put him back together because he's got his head cut off or whatever. And so that's what happened to King Charles. He was executed. And that effectively ended the majority of the English Civil War. Now, they did have a deal afterwards, believe it or not. There was a third English Civil War. 1649 to about 1651 was roughly the third Civil War. What happened was Charles I had a son, Prince Charles, who basically at that point declared himself the King of Scotland. And so Cromwell had to round up the New Model Army, and they invaded Scotland again. try to go after, Prince Charles, who's later Charles II, later when he becomes king. That led to the Battle of Dunbar. I think it was one of the most famous battles in the Third Civil War, where the Scots were defeated again, September 1650. And at that point, Cromwell tried to capture Prince Charles. I guess he was going to try to maybe have him killed also as well, because he didn't want him on the throne. But they think what happened was Charles, if you know the story, hid in an oak tree. And so Cromwell wasn't able to find him. And so he was able to get away. I think Charles later fled to France, where his cousin, later Louis XIV, would kind of help him and all that, try to get his throne back and all that. So that's what happened mostly in the majority of the English Civil War. Then they have this period afterwards that follows that I did want to talk about, of course, with the English Civil War. Of course, there's another picture, of course, again, of Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, of course, old Ironsides or Puritan Moses. And after the death of Charles I, there's a period in Britain that they call it different names. It's often called the Commonwealth of England, I think is a common name. They usually call it. Some people call it the Interregnum, because it's kind of between that period where the Royalists or the Stewart Dynasty is not in power. So it's kind of between there. They also call it the Protectorate, which I'll explain later, was, of course, a nickname because of a title that Cromwell was, of course, called at that time. And Cromwell eventually, what happened was he took over basically Britain, like England first, and then he also took over Ireland and Scotland as well. There's kind of a slide on that right here. And what he did was he made England into a republic, is what he did. So they often call it the Commonwealth period. But even though it was like a republican period in all of that, it was really seen as a military dictatorship, because he was, propping himself up as a dictator. Some people kind of saw him as a Republican head of state, but he did go by various titles. By 1653 to 58, he was either called Lord Protector, as one of his main titles. They had another title they called him too, sometimes, which was head of state as well. And it got to the point where the so-called rump parliament got even smaller. They call it the bare bones parliament, which almost became more like a committee of the parliament that was kind of running it, with Cromwell as its commander or dictator, basically. That's what it was. It was like a dictatorship in a sense. And it was especially one that was ruled by Puritans and a lot of their Puritan ideology in the country, which I'll kind of also explain a little later as well. But there's one thing I did want to talk about with Cromwell as well. Cromwell also forced this system, if you know about it, on other countries. So he forced Scotland to join it as well. He also forced Ireland also as well to join, in Wales. And there was a case where he went over to Ireland and basically forced them to adhere to the Commonwealth. Cromwell did not trust the Irish. The reason why, he didn't like Catholicism. He thought it was too powerful. And I guess he thought they should be Protestant instead. And so, if you know about it, he sacked and attacked a lot of their cities. Wexford and Drogheda were famous cities that were sacked by his forces. I think it's one of those two, Drogheda or Wexford. I know they massacred men, women, and children. And so, if you know about Cromwell, he's one of these men that's hated still today in Ireland. I think they call him the most hated man in Irish history, believe it or not. Yeah, 2,000, I think, they may have executed Irish like men, I guess, mostly. And Wexford was also stormed by him as well. So not a very well man that's liked overall. Now, let me also talk about one other thing that Cromwell is also famous for, when he was in power. Now, also the Puritans, one of the things that they did during that time of the Commonwealth, they basically forced a lot of Puritan like ideology onto the population. And you can see there's a lot of things that they did that were kind of famous. They basically shut down all the inns, theaters, pubs. They banned sports. You couldn't do certain sports. Like boys caught playing football on Sunday, of course, could be punished. Some of the punishments were very severe as well. Of course, Sunday was a very important day for Puritans. You can see work was often banned on Sunday. You couldn't like run, you couldn't walk, do things like that on Sunday. A lot of these so-called blue laws, I guess they call it. And there's even a deal where apparently the Puritans even went so far as to ban Christmas, which they did. So like the Globe Theater and things like that, were pretty much banned, in the country, etc. So they're very, very strict. The Puritans overall. This happened in New England too, as well, like during this time period. So it's kind of something that's kind of famous also in early American history as well. Now, the only thing though is Cromwell eventually died of natural causes because of age. And so what happened was he had a son named Richard Cromwell that came in next, that you may have heard of. Cromwell was not as well known as his father, wasn't really a military man like his father was, but you can see that the title of Lord Protector was almost even like a position that I guess they could pass it on, because there was a talk of making Oliver Cromwell king, like King Oliver, but they think he turned it down before his death. But Cromwell came in. He would actually be Lord Protector for about 9 months after Oliver Cromwell died. And the only thing about Richard Cromwell was that he lacked authority, basically, to run the country. Military didn't really trust him much. And so within about 9 months, he got deposed by the military. And later on, when the Royalists came in and took over, they basically gave him nicknames like Tumble Down Dick or Queen Dick, because they kind of saw him as this weak ruler who was more like a queen instead of a king, that kind of deal. So that's hence where the name eventually came from at that point. And I think he went into exile for a while, Richard, but he eventually came back to England after I guess nobody knew who he was. There is a famous story, though, I did want to talk about Oliver Cromwell, which you may have heard about this before. After Richard Cromwell was actually deposed, the English people were so mad about Oliver Cromwell's reign that they dug his body up and they hung him, even though he was dead. I think he dragged him through the streets of London, like his remains and all that. But Oliver Cromwell is a controversial figure, even still today. He is kind of considered one of, I think, Britain's most famous politicians, like up there, I guess, with Winston Churchill. So everybody kind of still knows who Oliver Cromwell is today. Now, what happened after that was they have this new period that comes in where the Stuarts are put back in. They of course, come back into power at that point. They often call it the so-called Restoration. They call it the Restoration of the Stuarts, or Stuart Restoration, if you want to call it that overall. So they returned to power in 1660, and they'll remain in power until 1714. And who do they put back in power? They put back in power Charles II, who's later called the Merry Monarch, which I'll kind of explain later a little about that. But there he is right there. Charles II, of course, was the older son of King Charles I. He had been in exile for a bunch of years. I think up to, I want to say 10, 15 years he had been in exile out of the country. And anyway, he eventually was crowned as king on May 29th, 1660, which I believe happened to be, I think, his birthday as well. And so he was crowned on now what they call Restoration Day overall. They also call it another name, which is they either call it Oak Apple or Royal Oak Day, because if you know about the story that I told you before, supposedly Charles II, when he was prince, had hid an oak tree when Cromwell's forces were trying to capture him in the Third English Civil War. And so hence the name being used, of course, later. We'll talk about him later, but he's kind of controversial. He and his brother James, the Duke of York, because they're kind of sympathetic towards Catholics. That's kind of a problem they'll have throughout their reign. And of course, one of the things that's a big thing that's a problem with Charles, that Charles doesn't have any heirs that can take the throne. And so he's got to give it to his brother, James, the Duke of York. And James, the Duke of York, later James II, is a converted Catholic, which is kind of a bad thing that they have later. But I'll talk about it later. But, the rest of the Stuart monarchs, we'll get into them, of course, later next week in my part 3 lecture, of course, on the rise of the British Empire. I'll talk about, of course, King Charles II, James II, of course, the sons of Charles I. I'll talk about William and Mary that take power later after the Glorious Revolution, which changes Britain to a constitutional monarchy. I'll talk about Queen Anne, who was the last Stuart monarch that rules over Britain. Then I'll get into the later part of the British Empire. I'll talk about the Hanover dynasty they have that's in power. Then we'll get to the current one they have now, of course, which is the House of Windsor that's now reigning, of course, with Queen Elizabeth II. So that's pretty much it for my lecture today. Before I go, I did want to remind you, don't forget about various assignments that y'all have out. Of course, the main thing y'all got that's out right now, of course, is the first exam, on the age of absolutism. So don't forget about that. That's due, I think, this Friday. I'll kind of send out reminders about it overall. And then, of course, the other thing, of course, I've got, don't forget the vocab. That second vocab is due next week as well. But I'll send out reminders also about that. By the way, sorry, Connor, I didn't. Oh, if you're still there, sorry about that. But I hope you're having a good morning also as well. So anyway, don't forget, if you have any comments, questions, of course, about the lecture, please let me know later on my channel. I don't think there's any comments right now, of course, live that are important. But if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can also do as well. So next week, like I said, part 3, of course, on the British Empire. Then I will also be moving on to talk about mostly the Age of Enlightenment as well. So y'all take care, and I hope y'all have a great weekend, of course, coming up. So y'all take care.